I'm Sarai.
And I'm Haley.
And this is Seamwork Radio. Welcome back to Seamwork Radio, where we share practical ideas for building a creative process so you can sew with intention and joy. And today we're talking about how to hold on to that creative sparkle you have when you're a beginner at something. And we're going to cover the benefits of being a beginner, why the beginner sparkle fades over time, and how to tap into it again. All right, Haley, we're going to start with our icebreaker for today, which is, when was the last time you accidentally made something ugly?
I love this question. I also came up with this question, so of course I love it. Just a couple weeks ago, Sienna and I filmed the sew-along for the Rhett jacket, and I pulled this green brushed canvas out of my stash. I was like, this will be great. And it's something I already have. I'm really winning here. But I didn't have green cone thread to serge my seams with. And so I was like, oh, you know what'll look really cute is gold. I'll use gold.
Like metallic gold or
No,
yellow
like
gold?
mustardy gold, like denim.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay.
Top stitching thread gold. So I was like, yeah, that'll be cool. And then as soon as we started filming and I started serging seams, I was like, this is straight up leprechaun. Straight up leprechaun. I don't know if that counts as ugly. I haven't made something truly ugly in a while. When I was pregnant, I made a brown sweatshirt for myself, and I cut it extra long so that I could hem it on, adjust it on my body.
Uh-huh.
And when I tried it on, it made me cry because I thought I looked like Friar Tuck. And I balled it up. I was like, I don't want this. And I think I gave the fabric to Sienna. I'm like, she loves brown. It's very on brand for her, but I look like Friar Tuck and I'm not having it.
A Friar Tuck and a leprechaun. I think you should wear them together.
It's gone. It's so long gone. I don't keep things in my life that make me cry.
That's probably a good policy.
I think so. What about you? When did you make something ugly last?
Well, the thing that comes to mind, it didn't turn out that ugly, but I made a YouTube video about these pants. It might be out by the time this podcast gets released. So if you want to see it, you can go to YouTube. It actually also has a little bit of a leprechaun theme. Not a leprechaun, but a gnome. And you'll see what I mean if you watch the video. But I bought this fabric. I wanted to make some Joss pants, which if you're not familiar with the pattern, it's like a pull-on pair of wide leg pants, super comfy. It's got big pockets, and I thought it would look really chic in a camel color. So I went to Mill End and I bought this camel colored rayon twill, and the fabric is really nice. But when I got it home, I don't know, did I mention this on the podcast already? When I got it home, it just looked like the same color as my skin, almost exactly.
The background to this is that Mill End is awesome, but historically just really weird lighting.
Yeah.
In there.
Yeah, very weird lighting. They have fluorescent. We definitely have talked about the lighting at Mill End. They have fluorescent lights and skylights, so it's it depends on where you stand in the store.
Yeah,
what color you're looking at. And it was so close to my skin color, it matches my foundation. I show it in the video. It matches my foundation almost exactly. So I was really afraid it was going to look like I wasn't wearing pants when I put these on, and the gnome comes into this, and you'll see why if you watch the video. But it is, I don't know how I feel about him, to be honest. I wouldn't say ugly, but I would say questionable.
Unfortunate.
Yeah. I'm just not too sure if I like wearing these. So yeah, these things happen.
Well, they're rayon, so they should take dye well.
Oh, true. Yeah. I could maybe do them a darker. I still like the idea of having a camel pair, so maybe I could do them a darker camel.
Do some avocado pits or something. Bring a little pink in.
Maybe a little bit pinker. I don't know. My skin is a little pink in it. It might just make it even closer.
Maybe I'm sabotaging you. I don't know.
Oh, so yeah, that's the last thing I made there. I was like, I don't know. I thought the fabric looked kind of not so great, but I made it anyway. So just to see how it would come out, and I'm still not too sure. So yeah, I don't know. That's the last kind of ugly thing I made. This is a good question. Good one, Haley.
Thanks.
If you have an icebreaker for us for a future episode, you should let us know. If you're a member, you can go to seamwork.com/go/icebreakers, and that'll take you to a thread on our community where you can leave your idea for a future icebreaker, and we'll probably use it on the show. All right, let's get into our topic for today. So, we were kind of thinking about this quote that comes from this book called Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind by Shunryo Suzuki. And it's an amazing book. It's a very short book. I listened to it as an audiobook, and it's only like 3 hours if you listen to it as an audiobook. Highly recommend it. But in this book, there's a really famous quote, and he says, "In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities, but in the experts, there are few." And so that's kind of what we're talking about today. I think beginners have this sort of inherent optimism. Don't you think, Haley?
Yeah, definitely. That quote really makes me think of the quote from Mean Girls, "The limit does not exist." In a beginner's mind, I feel like that's like very true.
Yes, yes. That's totally true. I think these two quotes from Master Suzuki and Mean Girls have a lot in common.
Mean Girls is deep.
Yeah, very deep. So, where does that beginner's sparkle go? And then how can you find it again? That's what we're really talking about today. So, how do you think, Haley, the beginner sewist approach varies from the advanced sewer's approach?
So I think I want to use an example from when I used to work in a fabric store. So when I would work in a fabric store, I would feel like I also taught there, and I'd have these students who were like fairly advanced, like were making like pretty complicated things, and they would come in and look through the pattern catalog and be like, "Oh gosh, I don't know if I can make this button up." And I'm like, "Do you know how to, sew seams? You know how to do top stitching? Like, you have all the ingredients. You just have to put it all together." And I think that's because they have like a good understanding of the challenges that different
Mhm.
projects can entail. They're like, they're coming at it from, I don't want to say realistic, because sometimes I don't think it's totally realistic, but they're coming at it from a place where they've like had some failures and they don't want to do that again. And maybe a little place of like judgment on themselves.
Yeah.
And then on the other hand, you have beginners that come in and they're like pulling all these bolts of fabric and they're like, "I'm going to make a bridesmaid's dress I have never sewn, and I'm borrowing someone's machine from their storage unit that hasn't been run in 20 years."
Yeah.
And you're like, "Oh, okay." On one hand, those people sometimes set themselves up for disappointment. And then on the other hand, sometimes they like walk in a few months later and they're like, "Thanks for helping me pick fabric. Let me show you the pictures from the wedding." And you're like, "Wow,
You did it.
You did it. You really pulled that off." There's just this like blind confidence that I think is really magical with a beginner.
Don't you think that's interesting? Because it seems like the logical thing would be that you would gain confidence as you gain skill. And I think that is true to some extent.
Yeah.
But in some cases or in some ways, I think certain people tend to lose confidence as they figure out what they're doing.
And I really, actually, now that I think about it, I think that it's more of this like maybe more intermediate level conundrum, because I think you do come out of the other side of it eventually, where you're like, you've tackled enough challenges that you're like, I mean, I can figure out anything. That's how I feel at this point. Have I sewn X, Y, or Z before? No, but like I could figure it out.
Yeah.
So yeah, I definitely think it's interesting and counterintuitive.
Yeah. But I see that. I don't think it's true necessarily for everybody who's a beginner. I think some beginners are definitely, we've talked about this in other episodes before, but there are some beginners who are much more, I don't want to say timid. I feel like that word has too much judgment in it, but
Cautious.
Cautious, yeah. And then other people who just like go all in.
Yeah.
And there are, as we've talked about before, there are benefits to both ways of approaching things. But I do feel like that has so much value in it, that ability to just jump in and not really care if you're going to get it right the first time.
Right.
Because you just don't expect to get it right the first time.
Right.
Yeah.
So what do you think the relationship between experience and creative problem solving is?
I think that's a good question, because I feel like when you have, there are benefits and drawbacks to both. I think when you have experience, you have maybe some tools in your toolkit for how to solve problems when they come up, and that can give you confidence. But at the same time, I think once you've learned certain things and you're good at doing those certain things and you have your ways of approaching a problem, you tend to reuse those same ways over and over again. So you get kind of married to the way things have worked for you before.
Right.
Whereas when you're a beginner, you're much more open to trying new things. And I think also listening to other people.
Yes.
And getting input from other people, because you're like, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm going to ask, my friend, or I'm going to ask in the Seymour community, or I'm going to ask my mom, whatever, whoever you have, or a YouTube video, whatever it is. And I think when you've got a little bit more experience under your belt, sometimes you'll just kind of do it the way you've always done it and not be as open.
Yeah. It definitely seems like there's like this lack of judgment in the beginner's mind of like not judging themselves when they don't know what to do, not judging themselves as much if they try something and it doesn't work. Where in the more advanced sewer's mind, I think that there's like a lot more, you tend to become a little bit more critical of yourself, I think.
Yeah.
You try one approach that has always worked for you in the past, and suddenly you're beating yourself up. And the fault is on you and not just, the way that it worked out that particular time. It can be like really defeating.
Yeah. I think that's an interesting point. Do you think that in the non-beginner's mind, there's more judgment generally?
Yes, because I think you have, I guess I want to say like the more perspective on the subject. You have more things to like hold it against. So it's easier to like compare things when you just have more experience with them, because you're comparing it to like your last 50 projects instead of your last one.
Yeah, I think that's true. I also want to be careful about saying that getting more experience is wholly a bad thing. Like obviously it's not. I think learning and gaining those skills is so obviously it's critical to, really enjoying any kind of craft that you want to get into. But I think it's this, how do you keep growing those skills and get all those benefits of learning new things, and at the same time hold on to the openness and the joy that you had as a beginner, and not squash that with things like what we're talking about, like judgment and closed-mindedness.
Yeah, totally. I think it's like, helpful to like recognize like thought patterns, if this is a thought pattern that you're listening to this right now and you're like, that totally resonates with me, or like maybe it doesn't, but maybe someday you'll be sewing something and you'll see those thoughts pop up. And I think that this episode is kind of, hopefully we'll be getting at some tips that might help you to overcome that thought pattern.
Yeah. As we were talking about this, I was just thinking about, I think we're doing these on YouTube, these kind of sewing battles of different, we call them sew downs, of different techniques. So Haley will do one technique and I'll do the other technique, and we'll let people vote in the comments which one they like best. But I think that's a really, like, seeing things like that, exposing yourself to things like that, I think can be really helpful, because you can, maybe the way you've been doing things is your tried and true way and you love it, and maybe you'll always love it. But maybe there are other ways that if you just expose yourself to them, you'll find something different, a new way to do things that you've never thought of, even if you've been doing it for 10 years the same way.
Totally. We get like kind of like silly and campy with the videos and like, like taking them very seriously. But the whole idea of it is that like there's no wrong way to do something.
Yeah.
And it's, in my mind, it's kind of like poking fun at the idea that there could be a wrong way to do something.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's something you see sometimes. Like, there are people out there who are very adamant that their way is the right way and anybody else who does it differently is wrong. And that's not something that resonates with me at all. Like, I don't really understand that approach to life generally.
Totally. I would say that's like very like a very seamwork thing, is to like, you got to do what works for you, find the way that feels good for you.
Yeah.
And explore, because maybe you haven't found the way yet. Maybe you think you have, but you haven't.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's definitely inherent to our approach, and not just, that there are multiple ways to do things, but that you should expose yourself to different ways and be a little bit more experimental, not get locked in.
No us and them. That's one of our core values as a company.
Well, let's talk about some of our ideas about this. So I'm going to start by talking about a little bit more about beginners and what I think is great about being a beginner and how beginners sometimes do get it right. And then Haley's going to talk about some tips for tapping back into that beginner mindset. So we've talked about all of this a little bit already, but I'm just going to kind of list off some of the things that I think are great about being a beginner. I think number one is that beginners often have this open and curious mindset. And that's kind of what we've been talking about, just being a little bit more open to possibilities and interested in exploring different ways of doing things. And I think related to that, they aren't limited by the shoulds of sewing. And I think that makes the creative possibility is a lot more vast because you don't have this idea in your head that it has to be this certain way.
Mm-hmm.
I think another thing, and we touched on this a little bit, is they aren't afraid to ask questions. So that goes back to what we were saying about listening to other people and getting input from other people. I think that is something that beginners are great at. I think if you don't yet feel like you have the confidence to figure stuff out on your own, it's a great learning opportunity to just take it all in from other people. And maybe that diminishes a little bit over time. I think beginners don't get as tangled up in the details and instead they focus on the creative part of it and being creatively fulfilled by the project. I think that's often because they don't know what the details are yet. And so they think a little bit more big picture. And I think that's a really great benefit of being a beginner, sort of like a new perspective on things. It reminds me of when you're learning to draw and you have to sort of untrain your mind to see all the details so that you can see things as they really are. I feel like that's something that applies in a lot of different contexts when you're a beginner. And then the fifth one is I think beginners tend to not beat themselves up over mistakes as much. This is probably not true for all beginners, but I think a lot of times when you don't go into it with the expectation that you're going to be awesome and everything's going to be perfect.
Yeah.
And some people do go in with that expectation and, that can be disappointing. But I think a lot of people, when they're a beginner at something, at anything, they realize, well, this is my first try.
Right.
And maybe it's not going to be perfect, but I'm going to love it anyway. And I think that's a real advantage of being a beginner. So I think those are all, if you are a beginner, if you're listening to this and you yourself are a beginner, I think you should celebrate that because you are in this wonderful place where you have so many possibilities ahead of you and so really a different way of seeing things. And even if you're not a beginner at sewing, maybe you're a beginner at something else too.
Yeah, totally. I think it applies to so much. So I'm going to get into how to, if you're not a beginner, how to tap back into that mindset of a beginner. So I have 5 tips for you. My first tip is to experiment and explore. So Sarai and I talked about how there's no one right way to do things. And I really want you to embody that. Try different approaches, try different techniques. Try not to get stuck in, tried and true. I think it's really great to get curious. And, you're going to make mistakes along the way, or you're going to learn things along the way. And kind of going with the flow and adapting as you learn is so important and so valuable. The next step is to seek out feedback and advice from others who have more experience sewing than you, or in whatever the, thing you're trying to be more of a beginner at. I think community is so valuable. I consider myself an advanced sewer. I mean, I've taught countless people how to sew, but this is a reason I really love the Seamwork community, because I'll go on there and I'm learning things all the time. Just people who are posting about projects that I've never made before, or little tricks that they learned, or maybe it's like a niche thing where they were trying out this cool new dyeing technique. And I'm just always in awe of the creativity. And it reminds me that no matter how advanced I am, I always have more to learn.
Yeah. I think that goes to, just exposing yourself to these things in a little bit more of I don't want to say a passive way, but kind of a passive way. Instead of, we've talked about looking up techniques or, getting input from others when you get stuck, that kind of thing. But there's also the just paying attention to what other people are doing and people who have creative ideas, maybe following people who have creative ideas. And I think that can be a good way to tap into this too.
Totally. I love like especially like older like vintage sewing reference books or
Mhm.
surface design reference books, even if like the aesthetic of the book doesn't necessarily appeal to me.
Mhm.
I love looking at them because it makes me feel like such a noob. I'm like,
Yeah.
wow, that's like on another level. I
Mhm.
could do it, I guess, but like I haven't, and it intimidates me. And I think that's good. It's healthy to feel intimidated
Mhm.
by something. That's like a little bit of the beginner thrill.
Mhm. Definitely.
The third tip is to not be afraid to make mistakes. It's really all part of the learning process. Sometimes, like our so called mistakes can lead to really valuable insights. It can inspire you to, go look up a different technique, find a new way, and that way may become your new favorite. So remember to bring less judgment to your mistakes. And if you find yourself really getting down on them, instead get curious about like what was the obviously there's very obvious downsides to, whatever mistake you make, but
Yeah.
maybe look for like the hidden gem.
Yeah, there's always something you can learn from any
Mhm.
mistake. Even my skin tone pants, like,
Mhm.
that taught me that I need to pay a little bit more attention to the actual tone and color and how it looks with my skin.
Always stand under the skylight at no
Yeah,
end.
and yeah, get away from fluorescent lights when you're picking fabric. That's probably my lesson.
All right. So the fourth tip is to get out of your comfort zone and try things that challenge you, even if they seem really difficult or really intimidating at
Mhm.
first. This is a great opportunity to introduce niche sewing. And we talk about this quite a bit. I'm a huge fan of niche sewing.
Mm.
I really like, for me, dabbling in sewing lingerie.
Mhm.
I feel like it's one of the reasons I never go like all out with it and
Mhm.
go, deep dive for an entire year is because I kind of like that it's an area that I know just enough about,
Mhm.
because each project I do, I get to like approach with like new curiosity. So whenever I'm feeling kind of stale, I'm like, it's time to make a bra.
Yeah.
It's time for me to feel like I know nothing.
Mhm. Yeah, I think there are a few different niches in sewing that are good for that. I think lingerie and bra
Uh-huh.
making is one of them. Tailoring, I think,
Uh-huh.
is another one, which is something that's cool because you can incorporate it into a lot of different garments.
Mhm.
It doesn't have to be like a tailored jacket. You can incorporate tailoring techniques into a lot of different tailored type garments.
Totally.
Um, and I think maybe investigating some of those books and resources that are about
Mhm.
those things. And it might be something else for you. It could be like making workwear and
Mhm.
learning more about hardware or making bags, whatever it is. Investigating some of those things and seeing how you could bring that into your projects is really
Yeah.
cool.
I mean, even just like going into your stash and finding the like hardware that you bought on a whim that really intimidates you, or the pattern that
Mhm.
you never make because you're scared, go make that thing. Your inner beginner will thank you. And then my final tip on the matter is to stay present and focused on the task at hand. I think it's really easy to get distracted by the mistake you made 3 pages ago in the instructions, or even start jumping ahead to the next step in your mind.
Yeah.
And staying present, it's not the answer to everything, but it kind of is the answer to a lot of things.
It is.
And you'll find, at least I find, that when I'm successful at staying present, I just get a lot more creative fulfillment from whatever it is that I'm doing.
Mhm. Yeah. That's very true. It is the answer to a lot of things. I've been thinking about that a lot lately. All right. Well, I'm gonna just quickly recap the tips for you today. This was a great discussion, and we talked about how beginners get it right and how beginners really have a lot of advantages when they're learning to sew or learning anything new. And we talked about some of those advantages, like being more open and curious, not feeling limited by shoulds, not being afraid to ask questions or getting tangled in details, and not beating themselves up so much when they make mistakes. And then we talked about some ways to tap into that beginner mindset if you're no longer a beginner and you're starting to feel that glow kind of lessen over time, or you're just feeling a lot of judgment towards yourself, towards your projects, or maybe you just don't have that exploratory spark that you used to have. So, some tips are to experiment and explore with different approaches and techniques, to seek out advice and feedback from other people with more experience, to not be afraid of making mistakes and recognizing that that's part of the learning process, to get out of your comfort zone and try some new things that challenge you, like niche sewing, maybe make a bra or something like that, and to stay present and focused on the task at hand and not get distracted by your past mistakes or worrying about the next step, which I think is a wonderful, wonderful tip that applies to everybody, beginner or not.
Mm-hmm.
So what's your big takeaway from today's discussion, Haley?
I mean, my big takeaway, I think, is that the value of approaching everything with like a curious and judgment-free mindset. I think that that's like that's actually like a really valuable lesson for like life.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something that I feel like I've learned with sewing, and something that's like a way that sewing has enriched my life. And I just like take that with me, and having this discussion makes me very grateful for that experience.
Yeah, mine is similar. I feel like, again, this is a really great life lesson. I feel that when you get used to doing something, or you get really skilled at something, or you
Mhm.
just, you kind of find your groove over time, you start to lose a sense of the big picture and all the possibilities in
Mhm.
life. And it doesn't have to be this way, this narrow way that you've prescribed for yourself.
Sure.
It's almost like that's now the easiest way for you to continue going, but it's not necessarily maybe the best thing at this moment. So it could be that you just need to take a step back and see things from an outside perspective, like a beginner would.
Mhm.
And I think that's something that applies to any creative endeavor, but I think it could apply to any number of things in your
Mhm.
life. So I think that's really good food for thought. All right. Well, if you are interested in creating more space for your sewing, if that's something that you need more of in your life, then we would like to invite you to download a free guide that we have called The Ultimate Guide to Setting Up Your Sewing Space. And this is a free mini guide that has tons of tips and ideas for creating a better and more functional sewing area area no matter how much space you have. This is something that's been on my mind a lot lately because, as you know, Haley, I'm building a little shed in my yard for sewing. So I've had a lot of thoughts about setting up my sewing space, and this guide has actually been really helpful for me to go through again and get some ideas, especially some organizational ideas. So if you would like to check it out, you can download it for free at seamwork.com/go/sewing spaces. And again, it's free. So you can just enter your email and we'll send it to you. And if you liked this episode, we would love it if you would leave us a review. Here's a review from Pam K13. And this one's really funny. She says, inspiring podcast, 5 stars. And then it starts out, I initially did not like this podcast. That's because I was assuming it would explain very technical sewing processes. Why I thought a verbal tutorial without demonstrations and photos would be useful is beyond me. Don't worry, I found the Seamwork YouTube channel. I kept listening to the podcast because I quickly learned it is about so much more than sewing. It has prompted me to think about the craft in a bigger picture and how it fits in my life. This podcast has broadened my view in so many ways, and I find myself eagerly awaiting new episodes. Thank you for an excellent podcast. Thanks, Pam.
I'm glad you found YouTube
Yes.
for that. And I'm glad that you came around.
Yeah. I love that she said she didn't like it and then she listened to it. Thanks, Pam. That's a great one. I loved reading that. I saw that on Apple Podcasts and was like, this is great. We have to read this one. So if you have a review for us, if you want to give us 5 stars, we would super appreciate it. It really helps people to find the podcast. So whatever platform you use, we use Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, wherever you are. We'd really, really appreciate that. You can leave a review like Pam's, or if you just want to give us a star rating, 5 stars would be amazing. Thank you so much. You can also, as Pam mentioned, follow us on YouTube at Seamwork Video. We've talked about some of the videos we're creating over there a couple times in this episode, and we're really having a lot of fun with it. And I think it shows. I think the channel is a lot of fun. So you can check that out at Seamwork Video. You can also follow us on Instagram at Seamwork. And if you'd like to join Seamwork and become part of our private community, plus get access to hundreds of sewing patterns and dozens of sew-along classes, our podcast listeners get a 50% off lifetime discount when you join at seamwork.com/go/podcast50. So that's seamwork.com/go/podcast50. All right, and that does it for us this week. I'm Sarai.
And I'm Haley.
And this is Seamwork Radio. Seamwork Radio is brought to you by the team at Seamwork. Seamwork's an online community that supports you in creating a wardrobe that feels right for you. When you join us at Seamwork, you become part of our private community of makers, and you also get access to monthly sew-along classes, a library of over 200 sewing patterns, and tons of great resources to help guide you through the sewing adventure that you choose. Podcast listeners can get half off a Seamwork Unlimited membership, which means you can download as many of those 200 plus patterns as you want at any time, and our community will be there to guide and support you. If you'd like to join us for half off, just visit seamwork.com/go/podcast50. You can also find us on Instagram at Seamwork, or visit our YouTube channel, which is called Seamwork Video. We love hearing from you, so let us know if there's a topic or a personal story that you'd like us to cover. Thanks for listening to Seamwork Radio.